didn't run. He should have, but he had a slow, sick understanding that whatever stood in that clearing wasn't passing through. It was calculating, measuring. Josh is a tracker, 20 years in the field. He came looking for what most people laugh off. He used trail cams, thermal, bait stations. He knew the risks, knew the woods, knew every sound a forest should make. But that night in Washington's Olympic National Forest showed him something incredible. What follows is Josh's account, told in his own words, exactly as it happened. I froze mid-step, heart pounding in my chest. Through the grainy green hue of my night vision, I could see a massive shadow moving between the trees about 50 yards ahead. All I could hear was the faint buzz of the electronics in my headset and the rush of blood in my ears. I tightened my grip on the small handheld receiver linked to my trail cam up the slope, hardly daring to breathe as the dark shape drifted closer. A soft crack of a breaking branch echoed to my right. I swiveled silently, raising the night vision scope back to my eye. There, another figure stepping deliberately over the underbrush. My pulse kicked into overdrive. One of them was startling enough, but two? I blinked hard, making sure the display wasn't duplicating images or glitching. No, the first silhouette was still there, paused behind a mossy trunk, and now a second one, slightly smaller, was creeping in from the right. My mind raced even as I forced myself to stay absolutely still. I was hidden in the shadow of a large Douglas fir, half crouched against its rough bark on a remote slope of Washington's Olympic National Forest. The air was damp and cool, and I could feel sweat gathering under my jacket despite the chill. I tilted the night vision scope to scan further down the slope where my trail cam, camera number 3, was strapped to a sturdy pine. I had positioned it to cover a narrow game trail that cut across the hillside. If these creatures kept moving on their current path, they would pass right in front of it within a few seconds. My left hand drifted to the remote trigger on my belt, an option to manually activate the camera if needed. But I hesitated. The trail cam's motion sensor had likely already tripped. It might be recording right now. Any additional light or movement from me could ruin everything. Instead, I held my breath and watched. The first creature emerged from behind the trunk, stepping into a faint shaft of starlight that filtered through the canopy. Even through the monochrome green view of my night scope, the sheer size was unmistakable. It stood upright like a man, but stood at least 7.5, maybe 8 feet tall, with shoulders nearly a yard wide. Its outline was shaggy, covered in dark hair that blended into the night. The head jutted forward slightly with no clear neck visible, and as it turned, I caught the glint of eyeshine. All the countless nights I'd spent in these woods suddenly crystallized into this single moment. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and forced myself to focus. I couldn't afford to lose composure now, not when I was closer than ever to the proof I'd chased for so long. The large creature paused on the trail, head raised slightly as if sniffing the breeze. I silently prayed I was still downwind. I had taken every precaution, washing my clothes in unscented detergent, dousing my boots and gear with natural cover scent, even sealing my electronics in plastic bags until I set up, to minimize any trace of human smell. But the wind in these mountains can be fickle, swirling without warning. I felt a light puff of air tickle my cheek and realized with a spike of panic that the breeze had shifted toward the trail. If I could feel it, they could smell me. As if on cue, the big figure rumbled a low, throaty grunt. The sound reverberated in the quiet. My hands tightened on the scope. He stepped forward again, slower now, almost hesitant. The second figure, perhaps a female, sidled closer to the big one. This one was a head shorter and a bit leaner, but still impressively massive compared to any human. She kept one enormous, long-fingered hand against the trunk of a nearby cedar as she peered out, almost as if ready to pull back and vanish in an instant. I could see hair draping off that arm, catching a hint of starlight. Then, movement lower to the ground caught my eye. A third shape, much smaller, slipped out from behind the big male's legs. At first I thought it might be a deer or bear cub that had wandered into the scene. But no, this smaller figure was also upright, moving on two legs, though a bit hunched as it stayed near the large one's side. My breath hitched as realization dawned. It was a young one, a juvenile Sasquatch, a family group. I was witnessing something exceedingly rare, perhaps unheard of in modern reports. The youngster looked to be maybe 5 feet tall, keeping very close to the big adult, its father, I guessed, often reaching out to touch the adult's thigh or hand. The big male gently placed a massive hand on the youngster's shoulder as they moved, a calming gesture. That simple, almost tender interaction sent my mind reeling. They were a family, living creatures with bonds to one another. I might have marveled at the sight longer, but a sudden pulse of light snapped me back to the urgency of the moment. Through the green tint of my scope, I saw the bright burst of infrared illumination. My trail cams flash. The camera uses an invisible IR flash that's nearly undetectable to the naked eye. But through night vision, it lit up the whole scene for a split second in stark white. The big male Sasquatch recoiled slightly at the flash. Maybe he saw a faint red glow or heard the click of the shutter. He swung his head toward the source, eyes glowing brighter from the direct infrared reflection. My heart skipped a beat. For one frozen second, none of them moved. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. In the scope's view, the big male took a cautious step toward the pine where the camera was mounted, his upper lip lifting in what looked like a wary grimace. The female hung back, one arm stretched protectively in front of the juvenile to guide it behind her. The youngster peeked around her hip, half curious, half concerned. I realized the trail cam must have captured them and triggered automatically. It might even be recording video now. But if the big Sasquatch decided to tear it off the tree or carry it away, I could lose that precious evidence. My mind churned through options in a split second. I had another trick. The remote in my hand could trigger a secondary strobe or take additional shots manually. It also controlled a tiny speaker on the unit meant to emit a decoy noise. I sometimes used a cougar growl sound file to prompt reactions. Perhaps I could startle them into retreating without revealing myself, but any action might backfire, spook them into bolting before the camera got a good shot, or worse, draw them toward me. I hovered a finger over the trigger button, my hand trembling. In the end, I decided to do nothing but observe. No sudden moves. I'd let the camera and the creatures play out their encounter, and only intervene if absolutely necessary. The big male was now right beside the tree with the camera. I watched as he leaned in, sniffing loudly. In the stillness, I could just make out the heavy, wet sound of him drawing air past his nostrils. Then, with a sudden motion, he reached out and poked the trail cam with one thick finger. The plastic box wobbled. He flinched back slightly, then seemed to get curious. In one fluid movement, he wrapped his entire hand around the camera unit and yanked. The straps holding it to the trunk snapped with a loud pop. A burst of static hissed in my headset, then went silent. My stomach dropped. The video feed to my receiver cut out instantly. Camera number 3 was offline. I clenched my jaw, knowing I might have just lost my best piece of evidence if that camera was now ruined. The male Sasquatch held the trail cam in his hand, turning it upside down as if examining the strange object. The device was small by our standards, but in his grip it looked like a child's toy. He brought it close to his face, sniffing it. I imagined him seeing his own faint reflection in the camera's lens, wondering what it was. He gave a low chuff, a huffing sound, and for a moment I braced, expecting him to smash it against a rock or tree. Instead, he did something I didn't expect. He set the camera down on a nearby stump, almost gently, as if deciding it wasn't food and wasn't a threat. I let out a slow, controlled exhale I hadn't realized I was holding. The trail cam was likely battered, possibly broken, but at least it wasn't carried off into the woods. There was a chance the memory card inside was still intact with whatever it had recorded. Relief mingled with my adrenaline. The big one gave another huff and turned back toward the others. He made a soft grumbling noise, and the female relaxed her stance just a fraction. She still kept the youngster tucked behind her, but I could see her posture loosen slightly. The male stepped away from the stump, leaving the camera behind, and looked around, scanning the darkness. He hadn't bolted in fear, which I found remarkable. Many wild animals, when startled by a camera flash or strange smell, either flee or go aggressive. These creatures were clearly wary, but their curiosity seemed to be winning out over blind panic. My mind was still reeling, but amid the whirlwind of thoughts came one crystal-clear realization. How did I get here? I wondered fleetingly in disbelief that I was crouched within stone-throw distance of not one, but 3 Sasquatches. This moment was the culmination of so many years of effort that it hardly felt real. It was almost 20 years ago, in these very mountains on the Olympic Peninsula, that I came across my first clue these beings might exist. I had been a skeptical forestry graduate student back then, out doing field work along an old logging road miles from anywhere. That afternoon, I found a line of footprints in the muddy bank of a stream. Huge, human-like footprints, each about 18 inches long with 5 clear toes. I remember crouching next to them, casting my hand alongside one track, my fingers spread barely reaching across its width. Something enormous and bipedal had passed that way. Everyone I later showed the plaster cast to laughed it off as a prank. Everyone except me. Seeing those impossible tracks pressed into the earth changed something in me. Curiosity, fascination, obsession, perhaps. I needed to know what had made them. Over the years, that obsession led me all over the country chasing reports and whispers. I tracked down anyone with a story, native elders who whispered of mountain giants, park rangers who swore they'd seen impossible silhouettes at dusk only to watch them vanish like ghosts. I spent countless weekends camped in remote forests, often alone, listening in vain for heavy footsteps or eerie howls. Nights like this, perched in darkness with expensive night vision gear, had become almost a second life for me outside my day job, and they were usually uneventful, heartbreakingly so. I learned patience and method. I figured out how to pick promising locations by studying maps and wildlife patterns, setting up my trail cams where deer or elk trails converged, reasoning that an apex predator or elusive omnivore might follow the same routes. I learned to mask my presence, move like a hunter but think like a scientist, cataloging every broken branch or strange scat I found. Most importantly, I learned to temper my expectations. Too many times a promising shape turned out to be a bear, or an eerie call turned out to be an owl. But I never gave up. Even as friends drifted away and colleagues smirked about my hobby, I carried on. Each tiny clue, an unexplained track here, an eerie recording of a whooping call there, kept the fire burning. Deep down, I always knew that if I persevered long enough, I might find myself right here, on the precipice of an answer. A faint, high-pitched whine in my earpiece brought me fully back to the present. The night vision scope's battery indicator was blinking red. I'd been so fixated that I left it on too long. My heart lurched. This was not the time for gear failure. Keeping my movements minimal, I lowered the scope and felt in my pocket for a spare battery. With trembling fingers, I slid out the dying battery pack and clicked a fresh one into place. It took only a few seconds, but in those seconds, I was effectively blind. I heard a soft thump of a heavy footfall and a low, rumbling exchange between the creatures. A pang of fear shot through me at being momentarily sightless. I hurried to power the scope back on, silently urging the green glow to return. When the image flickered back, I inhaled sharply. The male was now standing out in the open on the trail, fully upright and facing in my direction. He was about 40 yards away, and even with the grainy resolution, I could see the steady rise and fall of his broad chest as he tested the air. Had he heard the faint rustle of my battery switch, or caught a stronger whiff of my scent during those few unmonitored moments? I pressed myself tighter against the fir trunk, trying to meld into its silhouette. My mind raced. If he charged, could I even hope to react in time? My best hope was to remain undetected, or at least non-threatening. Through the scope, I saw the female and juvenile a few paces behind the male, partially concealed among ferns and shadow. The youngster clutched the female's side now, clearly sensing the shift in mood. The male took a cautious step forward, then another, his eyes fixed straight toward me, or rather toward the darkness that hid me. Each long stride brought him closer, though he still moved with an eerie, deliberate lightness for something so large. He paused and emitted a series of soft, clicking sounds from deep in his throat. It reminded me of the kind of low clucking a person might use to soothe a nervous horse. Calm, yet purposeful. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. That sound sent a chill through me. He was intelligently probing the darkness, possibly trying to provoke a reaction. He knew something was nearby, but he wasn't sure what. I realized I might be witnessing a strategy. This was not a mindless beast. He was cautious, maybe even trying to flush me out. I barely allowed myself to breathe shallow sips of air. For a moment, I truly understood how a deer must feel when it senses a hunter. I was the vulnerable one now. My heart thudded so loudly I worried it would give me away. Another step. I could see him even without the scope now, a colossal silhouette against the faint backdrop of the sky. He was perhaps 30 yards off and closing gradually. If he came much closer, he would surely catch my scent, or even stumble right into me. My mind screamed at me to do something, make a noise, shine a light, anything to keep him at a distance. But my body wouldn't obey. Fear and awe held me locked in place, crouched small against the earth. Behind him, the female suddenly gave a low, warbling hoot. It had an upward, questioning lilt, almost like an owl call, but with an unmistakable primate quality. The male stopped and half turned his head back toward her. She hooted again, twice, softly. He replied with a short huff. It felt as if she was calling him back, urging caution. The silent standoff stretched for what felt like minutes. The male remained where he was, still and watchful in my direction. My legs were burning from the tension of holding my position, a bead of sweat trickling down my temple. I dared not shift even a muscle. Finally, he made a decision. With a deep rumble that I felt in my own chest, the big Sasquatch exhaled and stepped back. It was a sound of resignation, or perhaps reassurance to the others. He began to withdraw, never taking his eyes off the patch of darkness where I was concealed. I let out a tiny breath of relief, careful not to make a sound. He must have decided to heed the female's call, choosing to avoid a direct encounter. In his bearing, I saw not just an animal, but a cautious patriarch weighing his family's safety over any urge to confront the unknown. The enormous figure retreated a few paces, then turned and shuffled back toward his mate and child. A swell of admiration mingled strangely with my terror, admiration for the creature's restraint and protectiveness. No sooner had the male turned than the youngster, emboldened by his father's change in posture, darted out from the female's side. In a few quick bounds on surprisingly long, gangly legs, the juvenile closed half the distance toward me, perhaps curious about what his elders had been focused on. My heart leapt into my throat. The juvenile's movement was swift and almost playful, a stark contrast to the controlled motions of the adults. It came within maybe 20 yards of my hiding spot. Through the scope, I saw it clearly now, a smaller, leaner figure covered in shaggy dark hair. It had a slightly more slender build, like an adolescent on the cusp of adulthood, but far more muscular for its size. Its eyes glinted green as it looked around, seeming to scan for any sign of the intruder they sensed. For one terrifying moment, I thought it had spotted me. The young Sasquatch cocked its head to the side, in the very same way a human might when trying to puzzle out a shape in the dark. Instinct took over. I shut my eyes and tucked my face down, pressing further into the base of the tree. I made myself as small and still as possible. If it caught the glint of my eye or a hint of my face, I would be exposed. A sharp bark cut through the air, a short whoop sound. I peeked just enough to see the juvenile freeze in its tracks. The mother had issued a firm call, one that needed no translation. "Get back here now." In another second, I heard the quick padding of the youngster's footsteps scurrying back through the brush. I opened my eyes fully and lifted the scope in time to see the female grabbing the juvenile by the shoulder, practically pulling it behind her. She cast a nervous, reprimanding look in my direction, though I doubt she could actually see me, and then turned to follow the male, who had stopped and was waiting a little ways down the slope. The male let out 2 low whoops, soft and almost musical, yet carrying an undertone of urgency. It sounded like an assemblage call, a let's go, if I ever heard one. Without further hesitation, the 3 of them began moving away, further down into the thicket and toward the deeper darkness of the ravine below. The female was half guiding, half pushing the youngster ahead of her, and the male brought up the rear, frequently looking back over his shoulder toward my position. In less than a minute, their forms melted beyond my range. I remained crouched, straining to listen. For a short while, I could still discern the faint snaps of twigs and rustles of movement as they departed. Then gradually, those sounds faded into the whisper of the breeze. I waited, counting the minutes, heart still hammering. A distant crack echoed from somewhere far down the valley, perhaps a branch being broken underfoot, but it was hard to tell if it was them or just the ordinary sounds of the nocturnal forest reasserting itself. Little by little, the forest began to come back to life around me. A lone tree frog started chirping tentatively, and then another joined. The chorus of crickets cautiously resumed its song. It was as if the entire woods had pressed pause and now dared to play again. Only then did I slowly rise from my hiding spot, every joint stiff and protesting. My legs were like rubber. I had to steady myself against the tree for a moment. The air was tinged with a musky, wild odor lingering in their wake, like the den of a large animal. Smelling it now in their absence reassured me this hadn't been my imagination. Something very real had passed this way, leaving a palpable trace. I looked toward the trail and saw my trail camera resting on the stump where the big male had left it. Cautiously, still glancing around in case one of them had circled back, I made my way over. The camera's casing was scratched up and one corner of the housing was cracked, but the unit wasn't completely shattered. I flicked the power switch off, no sense in draining the battery further, and carefully ejected the SD memory card, which held whatever images or footage had been captured. With hands that finally began to tremble now that the creatures were gone, I slipped the card into a protective plastic case and zipped it into my jacket's inner pocket. Evidence secured, I crept back to my pack and retrieved a small casting kit. Dawn was approaching and I didn't want to overstay my welcome, but I also couldn't leave without trying to preserve a tangible piece of this night. I found a clear partial footprint where the youngster had stood and set to work mixing plaster and pouring it into the impression. While the plaster set, I scanned the perimeter with my scope one more time, then with my own eyes adjusting to the dim pre-dawn light. All was still and quiet, aside from the gradually growing chatter of birds warming up to daybreak. Satisfied that I was truly alone, I allowed myself to breathe a bit easier. When the plaster had hardened enough, I carefully pried the cast from the ground. It came out cleanly, capturing the broad, flat outline of a 4-foot with 5 splayed toe marks. It wasn't a full track. Perhaps the creature had been stepping over a log with its heel not pressing fully, but it was clear and unmistakably not from any known wildlife out here. Even in my fatigued state, a grin found its way to my face as I examined the cast. I wrapped the precious cast in a spare cloth and stowed it safely in my pack next to the trail cam. The sky to the east was lightening now, a deep purple bleeding into pale blue. A low mist clung to the forest floor between massive tree trunks. In that early twilight, the woods looked peaceful, almost mundane, belying the extraordinary drama that had unfolded here just a short while ago. I stood for a moment, just listening to the normal sounds of dawn and processing the flood of emotions coursing through me. I realized I was crying softly, tears of gratitude and perhaps a tinge of bittersweet sadness. My world had forever changed in those moments. The unknown was now known, my quest fulfilled, and I could never unsee what I had seen. The legend was real, so much more real, and so much more than I had ever imagined. Back at camp at dawn, I forced myself to breathe normally again. The world was waking up. Birds trilled their morning chorus, and pale gold light filtered through the trees. It almost felt like any other dawn. I busied myself with routine tasks to stay grounded. With trembling hands, I lit my little camp stove and set water to boil for coffee. As the flame murmured, I opened my battered field journal and began scrawling down every detail I could remember. The familiar ritual of brewing coffee and taking notes steadied me, making the extraordinary night feel tangible and real. I filled pages with timestamps, descriptions, and sketches. I drew a rough map of the clearing and marked where each creature had stood in relation to my position and the camera. I noted the approximate height of the big male by recalling how his head reached a certain branch. Later, I would measure that branch at just over 8 feet. I described their sounds, from the soft clicks to the whoops and the bark, and their behavior toward one another. My hands had finally stopped shaking by the time I set my pen down. As I sipped the now lukewarm coffee, I replayed the encounter over and over in my mind. I felt a profound sense of fulfillment washing over me. I had always imagined that if this moment ever came, I would be ecstatic, and I was. But I was also deeply humbled. These creatures were not mythical monsters or mere figments of fevered imagination. They were alive, intelligent, and cautious, with family bonds and perhaps even a culture of their own, hidden out here from our world. To have been in their presence, even unknowingly on their part, felt like an immense privilege. There was so much mystery left, but instead of frustration, I felt only gratitude to have witnessed this night. I pondered for a moment what to do with the evidence I collected. On that SD card were likely a few grainy images or seconds of video, precious documentation, though I already knew it might not be conclusive to everyone. In my pack was the plaster cast of a footprint that skeptics might dismiss as just another hoax. Part of me wanted to protect the beings I'd seen, to keep this encounter mine alone for a while. I knew full well what could happen if news got out, thrill seekers tromping through the area, or worse, someone trying to harm or capture one of these creatures. After seeing them move together so naturally, almost peacefully, I felt a responsibility to them. Proof could wait. Those decisions could wait. As I hiked out of the wilderness with the morning sun at my back, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had set out in search of a legend and discovered a reality far more profound than any myth. The truth was out there in the darkness of those woods. On that night, I became one of the fortunate few to witness it. I will never forget those 3 shadowy figures gliding among the trees, the gentle giant guarding his family while I watched in awe. It felt real, because it was real. It's a story I will carry with me for the rest of my days, a reminder of the wonders that still hide in the wild and of the night when legend became truth.